She stood in front of him, her hands trembling, a photograph crumpled in her fist. His face was older now, lined, tired, but she still saw the man she'd spent a lifetime hunting, the man she believed had destroyed her father. "I thought if I looked you in the eye, it would feel like justice," Alice said. Her voice was calm, too calm. "But it doesn't. It just feels empty." The prison room was silent, sterile, as cold as the years she had spent building this moment. 20 years of questions, of anger, of grief turned into obsession. She had sacrificed everything, friends, love, her peace of mind, for this confrontation. He stared back at her, not with hatred or defiance, but with something that cut deeper. Regret. "I tried to protect him," he whispered. Alice's breath caught. That wasn't the script. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. A sudden wave of confusion surged through her, and for the first time she realized maybe her father wasn't the victim of betrayal, but of his own secrets. She left the room without saying another word, and just like that, the justice she had lived for shattered under the weight of truth. If this moment already has you questioning everything, don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you're the first to hear stories that aren't just told, they're felt. Real lives, real choices, raw truths. Join a community that dares to feel deeply. This is just the beginning. Alice Walker was 9 years old the night her world cracked in half. Her father, Thomas, was the kind of man who could make silence feel like a story. He was a painter, a dreamer, the heartbeat of their home. Alice remembered his laughter echoing through the house as he lifted her onto his shoulders, pointing to the stars like he knew each one by name. But that night changed everything. She was in bed when the shouting started, the slam of the front door, the voices. One of them, a woman's, sharp and commanding. Another, her father's, confused, pleading. Alice crept down the stairs just in time to see him being handcuffed, his eyes locked onto hers. "Everything's gonna be okay, baby," he said. It wasn't. Thomas Walker was arrested for financial fraud and conspiracy. The media painted him as a conman. The trial was quick, the shame even quicker, and then, a year later, he was dead. Heart attack, they said. But Alice never believed it. Deborah, her mother, shut down after that. She moved through life like a ghost. No explanations, no warmth. Their home became a museum of closed doors and unanswered questions. Alice grew up with a single mission: find out who had done this to her father. She studied, read every document she could get her hands on. While other kids went to parties, Alice scoured old newspaper archives. She became obsessed with names, dates, and connections. She carried the weight of his last words like a vow. By the time she was in college, Alice was already known as the girl who couldn't let things go. Friends came and went. Lovers left, unable to compete with a ghost. But Alice didn't care. She wasn't building a life, she was building a case. And somewhere deep down, she believed that when she finally exposed the person who destroyed her father, everything would finally make sense. The grief would stop. The ache would lift. And maybe, just maybe, she'd hear his laughter again, even if only in memory. She had no idea how wrong she was. Alice didn't just want the truth. She needed it like air. By the time she graduated college, she had already rejected job offers that didn't align with her real mission. Journalism gave her access to archives, court records, and people who wouldn't speak to a daughter, but might talk to a reporter. She never let go of the last image she had of her father, his eyes meeting hers as the police led him away. That look, not fear, not guilt, something else, something unsaid. That moment became the anchor to her entire identity. While others dreamed of careers and families, Alice built a case, a private, relentless investigation. She filled notebooks with timelines, scanned court documents, filed FOIA requests, tracked down names she'd only seen in footnotes. Her apartment was cluttered with boxes labeled by year. A mural covered one wall, photos, maps, string. At its center, a name, Michael Reed's. He was Thomas Walker's closest friend. They'd worked together in a non-profit before Thomas's arrest. After the scandal, Michael disappeared for years. then reappeared suddenly, running a consulting firm with suspiciously rapid success. Alice didn't believe in coincidences. She followed him quietly, online, at public events, watching interviews. His charm made her skin crawl. He talked about integrity in business, and every word felt like a slap. Then, a break. An old colleague of her father's agreed to talk, anonymously. He hinted that Michael had been in the room the day Thomas made the deal that would lead to his arrest. The deal Alice believed he never would have made unless someone close had betrayed him. The pieces began to fit. She wrote everything down, created timelines, dug through financial records that connected Michael's firm to shell companies linked to the fraud. To her, it wasn't just evidence. It was justice taking shape. Still, something gnawed at her. A letter she'd found years earlier, one of her father's last. It was vague, filled with sorrow. "I failed you," it read. "I made choices that I thought would protect us. I was wrong." She'd convinced herself it was self-blame, not confession. But now, with Michael in her sights, she pushed the doubts aside. She was so close. Alice believed that bringing Michael down wouldn't just restore her father's name, it would resurrect him. At least in her memory, it would mean he hadn't chosen shame. He hadn't abandoned her. The dream was never just justice, it was redemption, and it was personal. The closer Alice got to the truth, the more unstable everything around her became. She barely slept. Her world shrank to a single obsession, proving that Michael Reeds had betrayed her father. Every new connection she uncovered felt like a triumph, until it didn't. The first collapse came quietly. She found a box of old belongings in her mother's attic. Inside, a stack of letters bound with twine, letters from her father, written during his trial. Some were warm, others anxious, but one, hidden at the bottom, stood out. It was different. It wasn't addressed to her. It was to her mother. In it, Thomas wrote of fear, not of prison, but of being exposed. "They'll come for me," he wrote, "and maybe they should. I crossed a line, even if it was for them, for you, for Alice." Alice froze. Her hands trembled as she read and reread the sentence. Had she misunderstood everything? She confronted her mother that same night, slamming the letter onto the kitchen table. Deborah barely looked at it. Her face was blank, distant. "He was trying to protect us," Deborah said. "You were just a child." Alice exploded. Protect her, by leaving her alone in a world that spit on his name, by turning her into someone who couldn't let go. Her mother said nothing else. That silence broke something. The confidence Alice once felt began to erode. She returned to her investigation, but now her thoughts were clouded by doubt. What if her father wasn't entirely innocent? What if Michael wasn't the villain, but a scapegoat? She started pulling away from people. Her boyfriend Daniel noticed first. "You're not here," he told her during one of their rare dinners together. "Even when you are." He didn't understand. How could he? He hadn't watched his childhood crumble in a single night. He hadn't lived with a hole where a father's voice should have been. They argued, she cried, he left. The wall in her apartment, the mural, became chaotic. Strings tangled. Notes scribbled over other notes. Her certainty, once so sharp, was unraveling. She tried to double down, to focus, to push through, but for the first time she began to feel the weight of years, of pain, of truth she didn't want to see. The dream that had once given her purpose was now feeding her fear, and for the first time in her life, Alice wondered if she was chasing the wrong enemy. Alice stopped answering her phone. Days blurred into nights. Her apartment, once a controlled chaos of documents and maps, had become a prison. Empty takeout boxes, curtains always drawn. Her laptop hummed constantly, tabs upon tabs of court files and financial trails open like wounds that refused to heal. She had submitted an expose about Michael Reeds to her editor, a story she was sure would blow the lid off everything. But instead of praise, she got silence, then a call. Legal threats. Her editor pulled the story, citing unsubstantiated claims. Michael had lawyers, influence, power. She had suspicion and heartbreak. That week, She was fired. Alice stared at the termination email like it was written in another language. The job had been the last thing tethering her to any sense of reality, and now even that was gone. She didn't call Daniel. There was no one left to call. Sleep became something she fought against. Every time she closed her eyes, memories came. Her father painting at the kitchen table, the look on his face when the police arrived, that unfinished letter. The guilt started eating her from the inside. What if she'd destroyed the wrong man? What if this obsession was never about justice, but about filling a hole no one could ever fill? One night, she took a cab across town and waited outside Michael Reed's building. He didn't know she was there. She just sat across the street watching the lights in his apartment, imagining what it would be like to confront him, to scream, to break something. She didn't move. Then one evening, driven by some reckless instinct, she broke in. It wasn't planned. She just followed a resident through the lobby, took the elevator up, and picked the lock to his office. She had no weapon, no clear goal, just desperation. Inside, she searched drawers, flipped through files. Nothing made sense, and then came the security guard, police, handcuffs, just like her father. She spent a night in jail. The irony wasn't lost on her. Charges were dropped after Michael refused to press them, but the damage was done. Her mother called once, left a message. "You need help, Alice, please." Alice didn't return the call. She stopped eating. Her clothes hung looser. She couldn't look at herself in the mirror. Everything she'd believed in was cracking. The person she thought she was, the daughter on a righteous path, had become someone she didn't recognize. One afternoon, curled up on the floor of her apartment, Alice thought about her father's death again. Not just the headlines or the funeral, the silence afterward. How no one asked how she was. How she'd been left to carry the weight alone. It wasn't just grief, it was abandonment, and she had built her entire identity around that pain. She reached for a bottle of sleeping pills, not to end it, but to quiet the noise, to rest, just rest. But her hand stopped midair. There was a knock at the door. She ignored it. It came again, then a voice. "Miss Walker, I was a friend of your father's, Samuel Brooks." Alice opened the door, disheveled, eyes hollow. Samuel looked at her with a softness she hadn't seen in years. "I think it's time you knew the whole story," he said. She didn't speak. She just stepped aside and let him in. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she listened. If any part of this story is echoing inside you, pause for a moment, like the video if you've ever chased answers that didn't come easy. And tell us in the comments, what truth have you had to face? Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Samuel Brooks sat on the edge of Alice's worn-out couch, a man who carried his own ghosts in his eyes. He held a thin envelope in his hand, yellowed by time, sealed with brittle glue. "I've kept this for years," he said. "Thomas asked me to give it to you if I ever saw that you were drowning." Alice stared at it. She didn't move. "This isn't proof. It won't give you names or legal answers, but it might give you peace," he added gently. Her fingers shook as she took the envelope. It wasn't thick, just one folded letter. Her father's handwriting covered the page in uneven strokes, words bleeding into one another, frantic like he'd written it in a storm. "Alice, if you're reading this, then the burden has lasted longer than I hoped. I didn't mean for it to fall on you. I made choices, some to protect, some out of pride. I lied. Not to hurt you, but to shield you from who I became. I wasn't the man you believed I was at the end." She couldn't breathe. He admitted to everything. Not all the details, but enough. He had signed off on a deal that violated every principle he once lived by. Not because of greed, but because the non-profit they ran was collapsing. He thought he could fix it before anyone noticed. But someone did. And instead of fighting, he took the fall to keep the people he loved from suffering more. "Michael tried to stop me. He begged me not to go through with it, but by then I had already crossed the line." The paper slipped from Alice's hands. All these years, all the hate, the destruction. She had built her identity around a lie, not because her father lied maliciously, but because she needed to believe he was blameless, that someone else had stolen him from her. She sat in silence. Samuel said nothing. He just waited. Hours passed. The weight of truth settled in like dust in a quiet room, heavy, unmoving, but real. Alice looked around her apartment. The wall of conspiracy, the boxes of files, it all looked foolish now. Not because her pain wasn't valid, but because it had blinded her. "I've hurt people," she whispered. Samuel nodded. "You're not alone in that." That night, she didn't try to fix anything. She didn't try to rewrite her story. She just cried. For her father, for herself, for everything lost in between. And as the sun began to rise, a question replaced the one that had driven her for 2 decades. Not, "Who destroyed my father?" but, "Who am I without my revenge?" The next morning, Alice woke to sunlight leaking through the blinds. A rare thing in her apartment. For the first time in years, she didn't reach for her laptop. She didn't scan headlines or check old files. She just sat at the edge of her bed, holding her father's letter. There was no more mystery to solve, only truth to process. She didn't try to pretend it made everything okay. It didn't. Her father had still lied. He had still fallen. But so had she. And maybe that was what finally connected them. Not the perfect image she'd built, but the cracks they both carried. Alice spent the next few days in silence. She unplugged, took walks without her phone, let herself feel everything she had buried under her crusade. Then, one afternoon, she opened her podcast app and created a new recording. "Hi, my name is Alice Walker," she began. "And this isn't a story about vengeance. It's a story about pain and about what we do with it when we finally stop running." She didn't name names. She didn't accuse. Instead, she told her story, how she became a prisoner of grief disguised as justice, how she had chased ghosts until she lost herself. The first episode was raw, imperfect, but it was real. She uploaded it without thinking too hard. A few hours later, comments began to trickle in. "This hit me in the chest. Thank you. I've been angry at my father for 10 years. I think I finally understand why. Please keep going." By the end of the week, her inbox was full. Messages from strangers who had lost parents, believed lies, ruined relationships, chasing closure they'd never get. People who, like her, had used pain as a map, only to end up more lost. For the first time, Alice wasn't alone. She created a schedule. 1 episode a week. No scripts, just honesty. Each story she told peeled away another layer of resentment. She wasn't seeking justice anymore. She was seeking healing for herself and for anyone listening who needed it. One morning, she received an email that stopped her cold. It was from Michael Reeds. "I listened to your podcast. I think we both deserve a conversation. No cameras, just truth." Alice didn't reply right away. She wasn't sure if she was ready. But something inside her, something that had once only burned for revenge, now whispered something gentler. Maybe it was time to listen. Alice stared at Michael's email for 3 days before she responded. She didn't know what to say. Every instinct in her body still remembered him as the enemy. But now, after everything, after her father's letter, after the unraveling, she knew that refusing the conversation would mean staying in the same place forever. She wrote back, "Yes, 1 hour, public place. That's all I can give you right now." They met at a quiet coffee shop in a suburban neighborhood, far from the city's noise. Michael looked older, more tired than the polished figure she'd studied for years. His eyes, though cautious, weren't defensive. He looked like someone carrying a different kind of weight. "Thank you for coming," he said. Alice nodded, arms crossed, defensive. "I don't need apologies," she said flatly. "Just answers." He sighed. "I tried to stop him. I begged him to tell the truth. But your father, he couldn't bear the shame, not for himself, for you." Michael explained how they had both built the non-profit from nothing, how funding dried up, and Thomas, desperate to keep it alive, made choices that put everything at risk. Michael had found out too late. When Thomas was arrested, he wanted to come forward, but Thomas begged him not to. He said you needed someone to hate. He didn't want that to be him. Alice felt her throat close. She had spent 20 years feeding on hate, Her father had spent his last months trying to protect her from the truth, and Michael had become collateral damage in a story none of them knew how to escape. "I destroyed your life," she whispered. Michael didn't flinch. "No, I chose to stay silent. We all made our choices." They talked for 2 hours. It wasn't warm, but it was honest. Afterward, Alice walked aimlessly for blocks. Her chest felt heavy but different, like something was shifting inside her. Not resolution, but release. Still, healing wasn't linear. That night, she found herself staring at her old investigation wall, the photos, the red string, the rage. She took it all down, one by one, not out of anger or regret, but because she didn't need it anymore. In the weeks that followed, she kept recording. Her podcast grew. People shared their own reckonings. She began receiving invitations to speak, schools, support groups, even legal forums. But every time she stood in front of a microphone, she remembered one thing. She wasn't there to tell people what to believe. She was there to remind them that sometimes the enemy we chase is protecting us from a pain we aren't ready to face. And when we're finally ready, that's when the real story begins. It was the night before what would have been her father's 65th birthday when Alice finally returned to the cemetery. She hadn't been there in over a decade. The headstone was smaller than she remembered, worn by time and weather. She knelt beside it, fingers grazing the letters carved into stone. Thomas Walker, beloved father, dreamer, flawed. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she spoke, not for the dead, but for the girl who had waited years to hear herself say the words. "I know you weren't perfect," she whispered, "and I forgive you. I forgive you for the silence, for the choices, for not trusting me with the truth." A breeze passed through the trees above, and for a second she closed her eyes and let it hold her. This wasn't closure. Closure suggested an end. What Alice felt now was a beginning, one where grief didn't control her, but moved beside her, real, constant, but no longer in charge. When she got home that evening, she did something she'd put off for weeks. She sat down and wrote the final episode of her first podcast season. It opened with her father's letter, read in full. No commentary, no dramatics, just the words of a man who had tried to do the right thing the wrong way, and a daughter who had finally understood that loving someone means accepting their failings. The episode went viral within hours. Listeners flooded her inbox with messages of heartbreak, understanding, and forgiveness. Some said they reached out to estranged parents. Others said they cried for people who were long gone, and many just said, "Thank you. I didn't know I needed to hear this." But one message stood out. It came from Deborah, her mother. "You don't owe me anything, but I listened, and I'm proud of you. If you ever want to talk, I'd like that." Alice hadn't spoken to her mother in months, not since the confrontation, but something in those words softened the tension she'd held on to for so long. She called her the next day. Their conversation was halting at first, awkward, but slowly they began to unpack the years between them. Deborah admitted that she had known more than she let on, that the shame and her own fear had paralyzed her. She had thought silence would keep Alice safe. She hadn't realized it would turn into a wound. They cried, they laughed, and before they hung up, Deborah said something Alice never expected to hear. "Your father would have been so proud of who you became, even if it took pain to get there." A week later, Alice stood on a small stage at a local event focused on restorative justice. She told her story, not to seek sympathy, but to show what transformation looked like when truth was finally faced. The audience was silent, not from boredom, but from reverence. At the end, a man raised his hand. "How do you live with the guilt?" he asked, "for what you did to someone who didn't deserve it?" Alice paused. The room held its breath. "I live with it by not running from it," she said, "by doing better every day, by choosing truth over comfort, even when it hurts." Afterward, Michael approached her quietly. They hadn't seen each other since the coffee shop. "I watched it online," he said, referencing her final podcast. "You honored him, And you honored yourself. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just something that felt like peace. They shook hands, no promises, no new beginnings, just respect. And that night, alone in her apartment, Alice opened her journal and wrote a single sentence. I am no longer who I was, and I no longer need to be. It wasn't revenge that freed her, it was truth and the strength to live with it. There's something no one tells you about vengeance. It doesn't end when you get what you think you wanted. Alice spent years chasing a shadow, a name, a face to blame. She told herself that if she could just expose the truth, if she could make someone pay, her pain would disappear. But it didn't. Because vengeance isn't healing. It's a distraction, a powerful one. It gives purpose, direction, a reason to wake up. But underneath it all, the wound still bleeds. Her story wasn't just about a father who made a mistake or a daughter who misunderstood. It was about what we become when we let pain speak louder than truth. Alice used to believe her identity was tied to her father's innocence, that if he wasn't the man she thought he was, then her whole world would collapse. But what she learned was deeper, harder, and far more liberating. People are complex. They love us and still fail us. They protect us and still lie. And sometimes they hurt us for reasons they truly believed were right. The real weight of choice isn't in what others do to us. It's in how we respond once we learn the truth. Alice chose to forgive, not because it erased what happened, but because it allowed her to start again. Today, Alice Walker isn't known as the daughter of a disgraced man. She's known as the woman who turned her pain into purpose. Her podcast, The Weight of Truth, has grown into a platform that reaches thousands. Each week she shares stories of loss, misunderstanding, reconciliation, and the hard, messy path to emotional justice. Not courtroom justice, not headlines. The kind that happens when someone finally says, I was wrong, or I forgive you, or I don't want to carry this anymore. She speaks at schools, prisons, community centers. Her voice is calm, measured, not because she's forgotten the fire that once drove her, but because she's learned how to live without being consumed by it. She started a non-profit with the same name as her podcast. It provides resources for people navigating grief, false accusations, and family estrangement. Not to tell them what to feel, but to let them know they're not alone. Michael Reed's never returned to the public eye. He chose a quiet life, far from interviews or statements, and when asked about Alice, he simply says, she did what I couldn't. She faced it. As for Alice's mother, Deborah, they talk every Sunday. It's not always easy, but it's real. The legacy Thomas Walker left behind isn't one of shame. It's one of transformation. Have you ever believed something so deeply, only to find out you were wrong? Alice thought she was fighting for justice. What she was really fighting was grief, unspoken, unresolved, and festering in silence. And when the truth finally came, it didn't set her free right away. It shattered her. Only then could she begin again. How many of us are carrying stories like hers? Stories built on half-truths, assumptions, or silence. Maybe it's a parent you've never forgiven, a friend you cut off without the full picture, or maybe it's yourself. What would happen if you stopped chasing blame and started seeking truth? Alice's story isn't just hers, it's all of ours. Because at some point, we all stand at that same crossroads. Hold on to pain, or choose something harder, healing. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever discovered a truth that changed everything you thought you knew? Did it break you or build you? Tell us in the comments. Share this story with someone who might need it. And if you haven't yet, subscribe for more real stories that reveal what's hidden behind the choices we make. Because sometimes the hardest choice is to let go.